Welcome to the Prospective Doctor Podcast, brought to you by Med School Coach. Pre-med and medical students alike are encouraged to tune in each week for tips on how to become a strong med school candidate, gain acceptance into the school of your dreams, and succeed on your journey toward residency and becoming a doctor.
In this podcast, I interview Chase DiMarco, who is an MD PhD candidate. He is also the host of two different podcasts, the 1 Minute Preceptor podcast and the Medical Mnemonics podcast. He is also the founder of Free Med Ed and is the author of Read This Before Medical School. In this podcast, we talk about a host of different things related to studying and study habits. It includes things like evidence-based study methods, memorizing information, and we talk a bit about the common mistakes that a lot of students make when they're studying. So I think you guys will find this conversation helpful, or at least I hope you do. And thanks to Chase for joining me.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So when I was going through and doing a little bit of research just about you, I was scrolling through your podcast and I came across this episode called How to Memorize 1 Million Items. Is that something that's actually physically possible to memorize 1 million items?
Oh, it's mind-boggling.
You hear about these people who are memorizing digits of pi, but I've never heard 1 million items. So just talk about it.
That's all right. So it's really interesting. This is not something I have gotten to the expertise of yet, but that was an interview I did with Lev Goldentouch, and he is the instructor for a lot of other mnemonists out there and a colleague of several other very popular ones that have online courses and podcasts themselves. And his techniques are very interesting, very unique. They combine a lot of techniques that other people use. So for comparison, in memory championships, it's not uncommon to have to remember several hundred or even several thousand digits or names or something along those lines. So he took a lot of those similar principles, the same techniques that memory champions were using, but started applying them in different ways for more interesting information or for coursework or something along those lines. So his are extremely advanced. They are like mastery level of the techniques that I have not reached. Sure. But according to him, he can take these same techniques that you use for several thousand items and memorize up to 1 million items or more.
Wow, that's kind of crazy. So I wanted to have you on the podcast today because I wanted to talk about some study habits that will make students successful, number one, for the MCAT, but then things that will translate into success in medical school. And so I think a good place to start is to start with some evidence-based study techniques. I mean, a hot medical word is like evidence-based medicine, right?
Yeah.
So why do we never hear evidence-based study techniques?
I know, it's so interesting that this is not more predominant. And even though a lot of these techniques have been around for a few decades, I think that a lot of the strong research has only really come about in the last maybe 10, 15, 20 years. So you have some books like Make It Stick and other cognitive psychology principles that really form some of the most strong evidence base for study techniques and how we learn, learning how to learn, how our minds work, how we memorize, how we pay attention. So some of the techniques that I discuss a lot in my shows and books and stuff like that are ones that a lot of students are probably aware of, but might not be using yet or might not be using correctly yet. And some of those evidence-based techniques really revolve around, in particular, two techniques, which is the spacing effect and the retrieval or rehearsal practice. And basically what these mean is when you space out studying the same material over time, the spacing effect, you can remember them better, longer, and becomes more durable. Or when you rehearse material, when you recall it without a primer, without looking at your notes or flashcards or some sort of study aid, you're just recalling it from your memory, then you are formulating a stronger connection to all of that material. You're rehearsing it of your own volition, of your own memory, and doing that over a spaced amount of time is what we use as spaced repetition. And that is extremely, extremely evidence-based, strong technique that anyone can use. Pre-med, med school, beyond, it's universal because it has to do with how we learn.
Gotcha. And then what about this rehearsal practice? So is that things like flashcards or?
Most people will use rehearsal practice in flashcards because that is the easiest way to keep track of what you're studying. So when you look at a flashcard and it has a word or a sentence or something brief, and then you have to elaborate on a lot of material that you would put on the back side of this, that is a type of rehearsal practice. But you can do this in other ways too. You can go and recite information to a friend, a colleague, a family member, your dog, your plants, your wall. It doesn't matter who you're talking to, but the fact that you can recall information without any primer, without any study aid, is a part of that rehearsal practice. It's recalling the information on your own terms, as opposed to less efficient study techniques, which is more involved in recognition memory instead of recall memory. We recognize that we already covered this before, so we think we know it. But then when it comes to a test and we have to recall it on our own, or somebody asks us a question outside of the context of our class or textbook, we don't know the material. And that means that we're lacking the strength of that memory. We're lacking the depth of knowledge. And that has to do with the rehearsal practice. But rehearsing it in any fashion can be just as beneficial, especially if someone's asking you questions and elaborating on it even more. That goes into another technique, elaborative interrogation.
So before we get into elaborative interrogation, one thing I'm wondering is you kind of gave an example of rehearsal practice where you're talking to your dog or your wall or a parent, but kind of what does spacing look like? What does that look like in practice? Like how is that spacing out when you study throughout the day? Just kind of give me an example of what that looks like.
So there are different ways to go about this. I have a 1-1-3-1-1 method that I cite in past episodes of my podcast and other resources too. But basically, it's based around the idea of the forgetting curve. And research done on the forgetting curve, like Ebbinghaus and others since him, have really shown that we forget almost everything within 72 hours of learning it if we don't do something to reinforce that memory. We lose a lot of information. And then when we come across it later, we'll recognize it. So we'll think that we know it, but we don't actually know it that well. So when you're spacing out your information, just an easy to remember rule is the 1-1-3-1-1, which basically says within an hour of learning it, rehearse it again. Within a day, within 24 hours, do it again. The next, that's 1-1. And then within 3 days of that first 24 hour, then within a week, and then within a month. And that's just easy to do, just to remember in case you're like, when was the last time I went over this? When should I go over it again? But you can adjust this as you want. And a lot of software such as Anki and other space repetition software will space this out for you. And you can adjust the length of time. But basically, you can spread out the rehearsal of the material longer and longer as you go out, at least up until a couple months.
Interesting. Gotcha. Yeah, that reminds me of when I was studying for the MCAT, I set up like a spreadsheet, and each day I had essentially written what I studied for. That way, within 2 days, 2 or 3 days, I could say, okay, I'm going to go back and I'm going to look at this again, see what I can recall and go from there. But you're right. I mean, Anki has a lot of features like that too. So, okay. So back to elaborative interrogation. So what is that? It sounds like a police, something police would do to a suspect.
Think of it as elaborating on a topic. And elaborative interrogation is a little bit more specific. It's like a subsection within elaboration where you're really asking yourself detailed questions about the material. You're asking yourself, well, what if this happened instead? Or what if it happened to this person instead? Or switching out certain details so you can interrogate your own knowledge. Do you now have a depth of knowledge on that material that you can synthesize your own answers, not something that you've previously read and memorized, but creating that own knowledge yourself? And when you hit obstacles, whether this be in your rehearsal, you're thinking about something, you're telling someone about it and you forget, or an elaborative interrogation, if you're asking yourself questions and you're like, I don't think I can actually figure that out, then that's at least a point that you can mentally note or write down that you need to spend some more time on. And using these evidence-based techniques, you can gain better memory of topics and deeper knowledge of each topic you're exploring.
Kind of spitballing here, but you might not be able to answer this question, but the way I understand that memory works is you have almost like a central node. And so you can kind of add connections to that central node. So is that kind of a way then that you're adding these different kind of connections out and memorizing things through interrogation?
I suppose that is a fair mental representation to have for it. If you think of it like a concept map or a mind map where you have a central idea and then you have these branching points coming off of it. Right. And then those branching points can have branching points and infinitely more complex. And then you can connect different main topics together. And doing all of this internally, basically, instead of writing it out, is an interesting practice to try out, seeing how far your knowledge can go and where some of your weak points might be.
So one thing I wanted to ask you about was, and you mentioned it already, but it was Anki. What's your opinion on Anki? And is that something you used during medical school?
Yeah, I think that a lot of different software is becoming more and more popular every year. There's new gamification and new add-ons and plugins to a lot of them. Historically, for at least the past several years now, Anki's been a main front runner because one, it's free, and two, now especially, it has so many different plugins and add-ons that other programmers have made that it has a lot more functionality and customizability than some of the others might. It's not the easiest platform to learn initially if you've never used it before, and it's not the prettiest by any means, but it's free and it's easy. And like I said, a lot of customization. And there are different decks on a lot of these flashcard platforms that you can download from others. And there's pros and cons to that. You can definitely save a lot of time, but you're not necessarily getting the information that you need to or wording the question in a way that's personal to you. So I do tell people to be aware of that aspect. But I would say that, especially if you don't have anything else that you're currently using, and especially if you're on a budget or something along those lines, Anki is a great platform to start off with.
So what's the evidence between essentially writing the note cards yourself versus like downloading a pack of flashcards? I'm assuming writing them out is better, but is that something that's pretty well known?
I would say, from what I've seen so far in the research I've seen and the experts that I've spoken to, there are a couple of similarities, and we don't fully understand all of them. But writing your own notes versus typing them up seems to be a similar mechanism. Creating your own flashcards as opposed to someone else's. Just anything where you're actually producing the material yourself is going to link better. First, if you're making it yourself, you have to synthesize the information that you know in a comprehensible manner so that you'll understand it later on when that flashcard or whatever material comes back again. So it tests your knowledge as is. But then we also see that sometimes, like handwritten notes versus computer written notes, most of us can type very fast. And we can basically be a transcriber for our lecture notes without really understanding what's going on. Since we can't really write that fast usually, we have to write in the margins, we have to doodle, we have to organize things in a different manner in order to keep up with a presentation such as a class lecture. And that makes us really condense the material and synthesize the material better. At least that's one theory on why that has been shown more beneficial in several studies. So I definitely say creating your own material has its benefits, even though it is going to take more time initially. But the longer term benefits are what we're really going for in something such as medicine, where we have so much material to cover and over such a long period of time that a lot of the stuff we used in undergrad is not really going to work as well. We're going to forget the material 6 months from now or 3 months from now even, and then it won't help for board exams and other things along the road.
At Med School Coach, we know that matching into the specialty of your choice and the residency program of your dreams has a dramatic impact on your career as a physician. And your USMLE score is the most important acceptance factor of all. That's why more students than ever are turning to Med School Coach for USMLE tutoring. Our tutors are all 260 plus scorers and have been through rigorous training. Plus, the average student who uses Med School Coach tutoring raises their score by 23 to 55 points. There is an enormous amount of material you need to know for Step 1 and Step 2, and Med School Coach can help you be smart about how to study. We'll create a custom program just for you. Then, we'll help you master USMLE concepts where you need help most. You'll raise your USMLE score. We guarantee it. Visit us online at medschoolcoach.com and use offer code PODCAST10 to save 10% up to $400 on a Med School Coach USMLE tutoring package. You can achieve your medical school dreams, and Med School Coach can help.
So two other memory techniques that I saw, just on some of your podcasts, were Memory Palace and then Visual Mnemonics. Would you just speak about those real quickly?
A lot of medical students are probably aware of these techniques more so now. Not sure if it's entered the pre-med audience as much, but anyone that's seen like Sketchy Medicine, Sketchy Micro, or Picmonic videos, they are using the basic technique of the visual mnemonic. And this is creating a weird, wacky, sometimes aggressive or explicit type of association between material that you need to remember and something that your brain can remember visually. So The associations, if you've never seen this technique before, heard about it, can be very weird. If you hear someone talking about it, especially on a radio podcast, it's very weird. But
describe it real fast. Describe for me the weirdest thing.
For most
It's
people,
not explicit.
that's the problem. This is also why most memory champions will say when you're using certain memory techniques that involve using other people that you know, friends, family members, stuff like that, be careful because your friends and family members might end up in positions that you don't want to picture your friends and family members in. So but our memories are much stronger around things that are like violent and sort of taboo. You just remember them better naturally. So they can still be strong, but you want to be careful. Something a little more mundane. Let's see. I'm trying to think of one that I haven't used on another podcast anywhere.
Say I'm trying to remember some anatomy, right? We're in medical school. We're trying to remember some anatomy. So is this essentially just drawing a picture that's going to help you remember a specific brain anatomy or neurons or connections or something like that?
Kind of, yeah. Okay. There are different ways to do it in medicine, especially because medicine is so complex. It's not just multi-tiered, but it's like a spider web, and every discipline branches out to other disciplines that are their own spider web. So you really have this three-dimensional kind of construct when you're talking about learning in medicine. So for anatomy, for instance, we could create several different memory palaces, which we'll get into in a second, for different parts of the body. If we want to remember all of the arm muscles, tendons, arteries, veins, etc., in one area of the palace, and maybe the torso in another, we could divide it up that way. Or we could do it functionally. We could do something by certain diseases of tendons versus diseases of muscles. And there's just an infinite way to really create the palace aspect of it. But it does come down to how we initially broke down the material, how we wanted to remember it. And a lot of times the easiest way is just going to be copy whatever material you're currently using, whether that be the textbook or your school lectures. However they have formatted it is set up for you. It's kind of like reading an outline at the beginning of a textbook. Now you have a setup already to use. So you can save yourself some cognitive load there, trying to create your own, really specific and memorable organizational structure for the class and just copy something that's already out there. Once you have the outline, then you start associating different topics to different visual mnemonics, different visual aids. And then you use the memory palace later on to store these for longer term retention.
Oh, I see. Okay. So with that said, get into a memory palace.
So a memory palace is really anything that you can visually picture in your head when you close your eyes. That's the way I like to describe it. So most people will use houses, buildings, their house, their family's houses, schools, hospitals, offices, any place that they've been to, even a restaurant that they frequent often. If they can pretty graphically visualize the dimensions and the order of things, where the windows are, where the doors are, any obstacles, furniture, then it's something you can use. A lot of people even use outdoor ones, things from jogging paths or parks they go to a lot. Really, any area can be a memory palace. And all this is a location, a location-based memory. And that's method of loci is what a memory palace is otherwise known as. So by using this ingrained visual spatial memory that humans are generally pretty good at, we have a very strong visual spatial memory, we can then place these visual mnemonics that we've created, these visual aids, and by placing them in a certain order or a certain fashion, we can increase our ability to recall these without the need of external sources, such as flashcards, such as personal notes. I can walk through visually my house or my grandparents' house or something along those lines. And whatever I've placed in there, now I can recall later on. And I'll be re-inundated with that memory, with that information. And it's just much, much quicker than even flipping through your notes or anything like that, going through flashcards. And it's fun. It's really creative. So it adds a new technique to every student's arsenal. You don't need to use it for everything, but it can really add a lot of interesting dynamic aspects to the learning process itself.
Yeah, interesting. So that's kind of some of the things that you should do when you're studying. What are some common mistakes that you see students make? And, is there any study techniques you've seen people use where you just like look at it and face palm and like, what are you doing?
Yeah, I pretty much recall everything I did in undergrad and most of med school. I fell into the same trap a lot of students do, and that is relying too heavily on what we call passive learning techniques. So this can be a wide range of things, but some of the more common ones are rereading your notes, rereading a chapter, overly highlighting things in a textbook, or even listening to podcasts and watching lecture videos. If you're not doing something else with these activities, in and of themselves, they're passive learning because you don't have to take any action to learn the material. You're not taking any action to make sure that you retain the material later on. So people will often read their notes and go through their textbook and say, okay, I recognize that, I recognize that, I recognize that. But remember, this is recognition memory. It's not recall memory. We're not able to recall in that detail unless we've practiced that way before. Most people anyway. So even if you're listening to a podcast or watching a video or something, you can take notes on it, or you can try to think up visual markers once you have the technique down. It would take way too long to go into how to do that technique. Go to the podcast for more information on that. But once you have the technique done, you could start creating memory palaces as you're listening to a podcast on a bike ride or while you're driving. You can create visual markers for the points that are discussed in that podcast and then store it somewhere. So you can make passive learning active by taking certain actions. So I recommend not doing the passive in and of itself. And again, a lot of that is rereading your own notes and rereading chapters in a textbook or even pages of a textbook. If you didn't get it down the first time, there's a reason you probably didn't get it down. And there's no reason to believe you're going to get it down in future repetitions unless you change something.
At Med School Coach, we know that getting into medical school is hard. In fact, 60% of pre-meds who apply to a medical school don't even get accepted. And if you want to get accepted into a top medical school, it's even harder. That's why more students than ever are turning to MCAT tutoring by Med School Coach. Our tutors are all 99th percentile scorers, have been through rigorous training, and can help raise your MCAT score by 12 points or more. You need every competitive advantage you can get to get into med school, so why not get one-on-one tutoring from Med School Coach? Our expert team will create a custom program just for you and help you master MCAT content where you need the help most. You'll raise your MCAT score. We guarantee it. Visit us online at medschoolcoach.com and use offer code PODCAST10 to save 10% up to $400 on a Med School Coach MCAT tutoring package. You can achieve your medical school dreams, and Med School Coach can help.
This might be more of kind of advice from you, not necessarily evidence-based, but I wanted to ask you about kind of the effects of sleep, exercise, healthy diet on learning. Is there any science that you're familiar with that you could talk about? If not, what is some advice you have there?
I would definitely say those are important in every aspect of our day-to-day life and health. And I just feel like a lot of the information on these topics, on exercise, on diet, on sleep, has been out there and been relatively stable for a long time. But similar to a doctor telling a patient, if educators tell their students, it kind of goes in one ear and out the other without stronger guidance. So I can say, yes, if you eat better, you will remember more and study less or need to study less. Or if you have better sleep hygiene, that is going to positively impact your learning. But what does that actually mean to you? Do you understand what those terms are? Do you know specifically what you need to do on a day-to-day basis for those benefits to be seen? And I'd say most people don't, or even if they do, they don't know how to implement the changes they need for more progress. And keeping a healthy diet is pretty obvious. Stay away from a lot of sugars and prepackaged foods, salty foods. But further than that, you could actually read some stuff that, registered dietitians have to go through. What are the recommendations that they give their patients and that they recommended to doctors to give their patients? You can read about proper sleep hygiene and see how that conflicts from what you currently do. There are online free tests to assess your sleep score. And will you actually make the changes you need? If you're staying up later on the weekends and it's affecting your weekday sleep schedule, which usually it does for a couple of days afterwards, are you going to make the changes necessary? So all of these aspects of like general health benefit are good all around. But in specific for memory, they do decrease the cognitive load stress that we have on a day-to-day basis. So you have like a maximum amount of mental energy per day. At some point, you're going to get worn out. You can't remember another thing. You can't read another page. Well, if you are healthier, you have better blood circulation, you're more rested, you're, in general healthier,
Right.
then you're going to be able to do that longer. And there's a higher likelihood more material is going to transition from your short-term memory to your long-term memory. So there's a lot of mixed research on all this, but it kind of just comes into general health benefit. And it's definitely something students should get in the habit of now, because it'll help you later on. It'll help your patients later on.
Yeah. And it could be an incremental thing. Like maybe all these only help you a little bit, but I mean, you can use every little advantage you can get on the MCAT, and even I'm sure in medical school, every little thing is going to add up. So
Definitely. It's something we bring up a lot in the book, Read This Before Medical School, is just we are not going for perfection, because there's no such thing. All you can do is see where your weak points might be, where you can make the greatest benefits, and then incrementally add to that, a little bit here, a little bit there, and be the best you can be.
Yeah. And so speaking of medical school, I think a lot of people that listen to my podcast are going to be medical students, hopefully are going to be medical students. And so with that said, I wanted to ask you, what part of medical school is most difficult for you? And did you use these memorization techniques, memory techniques during medical school?
So my story is kind of weird. It's all over the place. I did not come from a background in education, in medicine. I was the first one to get a bachelor's degree in my family.
Wow.
Definitely first one to go into medical school or anything like that. But I actually went to a Caribbean school, so international medical school. And the setup there is very different than what most US students are going to be used to. And I'd say the hardest thing from school was probably twofold. One would be socially, just the isolation of being on an island without your friends and family. Med school is stressful. And if you don't have those social supports, it's just that much more difficult to fall behind, to get depressed, to not want to continue on.
Yeah.
As far as the educational aspect, obviously, you're going to get a different type of education in different types of environments. And some of that has to do with the resources that a certain school might have available. But some of it is just personally, I know a lot of it came from not really knowing how to study effectively, which is why I actually started the Medical Mnemonics podcast. Was around my end of my third year, beginning of my fourth year, I was struggling a lot still, despite knowing a fair amount about education. I actually had a master's in educational psychology that I finished up my first semester in med school. So I knew some of this stuff, but I didn't know how to use it properly when it comes to evidence-based techniques anyway. But then I started finding out about the mnemonics, and I knew about Sketchy, but I didn't really have the best luck trying to remember other people's mnemonics, even when they were in these visual formats. And I started finding other resources and podcasts and videos online of other mnemonists, other mnemonics experts and trainers, and learning from them over the past year and a half and having a lot of them on my show has been a godsend. First off, it's taught me so much more about my own abilities and weaknesses. And when you're combining some of the mnemonics training that they teach there, that I teach in my show, with the evidence-based techniques that are more based on a cognitive psychology aspect, it's like peanut butter and chocolate. It's something that hasn't really been combined too much in the past. And since I've been trying to bring these two together to meld them for the medical student and pre-med audience, I think a lot of students have enjoyed the show. I think the download numbers kind of speak to that. But it's just such an interesting concept to have all of this unique and useful and evidence-based or experience-based techniques for learning that we were never taught. I was never taught any of this in undergrad or anything like that. And pretty much every single person I've spoken to, or any physician I've spoken to either, none of them knew any of this. And most of the instructors don't know any of this information too. They were never trained in cognitive psychology. They were never trained in really teaching. They just know their material. They know a lot about their material, but not necessarily how to make sure you know the material too.
Which is an important part. And I was going to ask you, like, why is this not a part of a curriculum? Maybe a week-long class where you go, an hour a day for a week and just learn about different study habits and like bring up evidence-based study habits and health and fitness. Why is there not classes like that?
It's beyond me. I think a lot of the disconnect between teachers, between cognitive psychologists on the learning aspect, and then just the medical community in general being really focused on medical, not really education not even medical education sometimes, but medical. There's a lot of different fields here that maybe didn't have the best way to communicate years ago. I'd say some of those borders are finally starting to be broken down a little bit more. There's a lot more information out there freely. Podcasts are getting more and more popular, so people can reach out to others a lot easier and find out experts in their field easier than they could in the past. And I don't know why it's still not being implemented in most schools anyway. There might be a couple out there I'm not aware of. If you know of one, please let me know. I'd be interested to see how they're actually implementing it in a school curriculum.
Me too.
But yeah, it's just something that's not thought of. I think most physicians, whether they innately feel this way or it's just sort of how they learned, it's like, well, I learned this way, so you need to learn this way. And that way doesn't work for everyone. So whether it be in the basic sciences or later in the clinical setting, sometimes you need to get outside of how you learned or how they learned or how that person taught you. Figure out what actually works. Find out what the science is behind it and try to use those. And you can make incremental changes there if you're a teacher. You can add this thing here, can add that thing next week. Or as a student, you don't need to do all of these at once, but you can add one, get used to it, get out of your comfort zone a little bit. And then once you get comfortable there, add another and constantly improve. Constantly getting out of your comfort zone is a way to gain mastery.
Cool. So just to kind of summarize this conversation for the listener, I think kind of the big things that we were talking about earlier in terms of evidence-based studying was some of the rehearsal techniques we talked about. We talked about spacing, which is something, I did a little bit, I guess, kind of without even realizing I was doing that. One last thing too, was interleaving. And I kind of forgot to ask about this earlier, so I'm going to ask about it at the very end here. But what exactly is interleaving and what's the evidence there?
So interleaving is a difficult one, which is why sometimes I don't add it as strongly as the others. So there's a lot of evidence for interleaving in certain scenarios. But what interleaving basically means is switching up what you are studying within a study session or over time. So instead of Monday is going to be all biology, Tuesday is going to be all physics, Wednesday is going to be all chemistry, you switch it up where you have a 30-minute, 60-minute segment of one, then you come back, study another, then you come back and study another, then maybe you come back and study the first one again, and you just jostle back and forth between different topics. And the theory behind this is when you're learning about different topics, you are now formulating different networks initially, but they can begin to overlap. And when you have a common connection between all of these different disciplines, all these different courses, you'll gain a deeper understanding of the material in total. The problem is it's very difficult to know the best formula in different scenarios and with different material. So it's something that if you want to use as a student now, just play around with it and see what works for you, because there's no hard and fast rule on the ultimate way to interleave.
There's no 1-1-3
no
technique on that? No?
Not on that one.
Gotcha. All right. Well, Chase, thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
I hope you guys found this podcast helpful, and thanks again to Chase for joining me.
Each episode of the Prospective Doctor podcast is brought to you by Med School Coach. To access articles, videos, webinars, and free tools to help you succeed on your journey toward med school and beyond, visit our website, prospectivedoctor.com. We hope you tune in again next time.